Last time I ruined my financial well-being. This time, let's put it to use. Now that we're done milking the engine content, we can start working on the car. First, we start by removing the two motor mounts.
There we go.
With everything open, I took an opportunity to give everything a quick cleaning with some Simple Green, wiping down years of dirt and grease that have been building up. It's worth the time and effort to have a clean area to work with, and later on it'll help us spot any leaks that may occur. There's a hard line for the brake booster on the firewall. We need to unbolt it and use a pipe cutter to cut it right before the bend. Now we take the stock coolant line running to the radiator and cut it, leaving about 2 inches after the bend. Install the right hand side custom motor mount and torque it to 38 foot-pounds. Next we install the front motor mount and torque it to 38 foot-pounds. Moving down to the subframe, remove the old motor mount and install the new one. Don't torque this one down yet, so there's a bit of play when we go to install the motor. On the transmission, there's a counterweight that needs to be cut off. I don't know what happened in this footage, so here's the before and after. Remove the shifter bolts and install the adapter bracket. I couldn't find a torque spec, but if I had to guess, I'd say around 12 foot-pounds. Now we can place the new shifter mechanism, attach the linkages, and torque it down to about 12 foot-pounds. Next, we install the transmission motor mount. Again, don't tighten it to keep the engine install easier. Now we attach the clutch line to the slave cylinder made for the new transmission. Remember to include a crush washer on both sides of the fitting to prevent any leaks. You can take the stock clutch line and extend it, but in this case, I'm using a new stainless steel line. Unclip it and unbolt it. Try to minimize the air you let in because these systems aren't easy to bleed. Tighten up the new line and reinstall the clips. The last part in the engine bay for now is to install the fuel fitting onto the fuel line. Now we move on to the most intimidating part, which is the wiring. This is an OEM charge harness from an RSX Type S. The first modification we need to make is cutting the stock Honda ends and crimping on a ring terminal meant for 4-gauge wire. I'd also recommend using some heat shrink to keep everything protected and insulated. Next, we need to modify the injector plugs to fit our Acura RDX injectors. We start by removing the old plugs. Push on the little plastic insulators, crimp or preferably solder on the metal prongs, then insert each wire into the connector until it clicks into place. Don't worry about the orientation of the wires, fuel injectors don't have polarity, they're just generic valves. Now we have to backtrack a bit and go back to the engine. We need to install the throttle position sensor on the throttle body. Due to the nature of this swap, we need to install a plate that changes the orientation of the idle air control valve and then install the valve. The idle air control valve is held on by 2 bolts torqued to 8 foot-pounds. Now we can go ahead and reinstall the throttle body onto the intake manifold. Once installed, we can also place the map sensor. Next, we cap off some extra coolant and vacuum ports next to the throttle body, cam position sensors,
If you have to ask me to plug your hole.
on the intake manifold, and next to the exhaust manifold. I recommend placing the oil dipstick to prevent anything from entering the engine. Next is plugging in the harness. Just start at the injectors and work your way down, tracing the harness to each sensor. I honestly didn't do any of it. Luckily I had Handsome Simon and my buddy Kevin on the job, but it seemed pretty easy. With the wiring harness in place, we can install the last piece, which is the rear motor mount.
Yeah, I think I already did it. I frigged up. I don't like that. I don't like it.
I think that's where the night ends. So what happened is that the threads were stripped on the transmission I bought. The plan is to drill a hole to the proper diameter and use a heel coil kit to repair the threads. It was working until we ran into problem number 2. That was gonna be
I don't think there's any.
Is there any coming out? We broke through it to the inside.
No way.
Oh, dude.
I mean,
Put a bolt with a bunch of Honda Bond on it. So that was the plan. We ran a bunch of oil through to get as much of the metal shavings that we could out of the transmission. We put some Honda Bond with hopes and prayers onto the bolt, then torqued down the 2 bolts for the rear mount to 38 foot-pounds and reinstalled the exhaust manifold. The engine's on a furniture dolly, which allows us to push it into the engine bay. It's been years in the making, but we finally get our first look at what this is going to look like when it's installed. With everything close to its resting place, we're going to finish up the wiring. We start by opening the relay box, locate the IG2 relay and the main EFI relay, and now Can Do Kevin will explain what to do.
Goes to there, to there. We're gonna cut here, put that here.
So we're cutting the white wire with a black line and splicing it into the black and yellow wire. All we're doing here is switching the power source for the main relay. Toyota likes to use the ignition, but the Honda system uses the ECU to power everything up. Double check everything you do here because it can permanently damage your ECU. When raising the engine up, we noticed that the intake manifold was making contact with the firewall. As far as I'm aware, I'm the first person attempting to run an RBC intake manifold in a Spider, so for fitment, I had to break out some special tools. Now with the firewall out of the way, we can put the engine back and mount up the AC compressor to the adapter held on by 2 bolts torqued at 18 foot-pounds. As we began raising the engine up, we noticed that there is still something interfering. We realized that this adapter for the AC compressor will not work with a K24 swapped in. Since the K24 is slightly taller than a K20, the pulley interferes with this brace on the rear. I probably could modify the mount, but I wanted to move forward, so I just removed the AC, and I'm just going to hate myself later for it. Now we can take the harness and feed it through the firewall. Next, we want to attach the fuel line to the fitting we installed earlier. It's tough to get a good camera angle, but it's just tightening the fitting similar to the clutch line. This next part is the worst part of the whole swap. The shifter cables need to go into the shifter bracket. The whole bracket is pretty far out of reach and the hardware holding the tabs is comedically small, making it impossible for my fat fingers to handle. Once the cables are in the bracket and attached to the linkages, test out that your shifter can go into each gear. As the cherry on top, I actually had to redo it because my shifter cables were swapped. Now we attach the stock coolant line to our thermostat housing. There's no possible way I could have filmed this, so I'm just showing it here. And on the top of the engine, we use a coupler to join the stock coolant line that we cut off to the piece that was cut off. Align and then attach it to the upper coolant housing on the motor. There's an additional vacuum line that needs to be trimmed, then attached to the intake manifold. I wish I did this early in the process. As you can see, there's no clearance and I definitely did not want to lower the engine again. Take the charge harness, look at the ends that we crimped on, take the black cable with the white stripe, and ground it to your fuse box. Next we need to reattach the rear subframe. The rear motor mount can be stubborn, so you may need to break out more special tools. I don't know how it happened, especially considering I only took off the subframe, but the threads were messed up, so I had to run a tap through the hole to clean up the threads. My modified exhaust headers actually contacted the subframe, so I had to loosen them up to install it. Now we go through and make sure all the coolant lines we modified are clamped down, along with the ones on the coolant reservoir. When you're done, the lines will run like this. I'm not happy with how chopped up it is. Hopefully we can get a custom one made up one day.
My dad would love it.
Next we install the accessory belt. The spacing was so tight that there was no way I could get any footage, but it's like any other car. Now onto the second worst part of the swap. Since we mess with the clutch line, we need to bleed it and get all the air out of the system. If your pedal is doing this, there's definitely air. It took a couple hours until I went and bought a hand-operated vacuum bleeder, which I highly recommend. Once bled, attach the slave cylinder to the transmission held on by 2 bolts torqued to something. This all takes place under the car and there's no way I could record any footage. Now the final steps. Fill up the transmission with the recommended fluid, install an oil filter, and fill it up with oil. I grabbed some cheap, non-synthetic oil for the first start. We don't want all the extra detergents that come with synthetic oil just yet. Now we attach the battery, put in some fuel, and listen to the first noise this car has made in years. And no crank. I was pretty frustrated at this point, but after some digging, it turned out that the starter has the main power going to it, and another wire that sends the signal. That second wire wasn't connected. So here comes attempt number 2 at firing it up. If you watch my last video, you know how much money I have into this thing. So right now I'm a nervous wreck and I'm just praying it doesn't explode.
Alright, let me give it a shot. Alright.
That is a massive milestone for us in this build, and to be honest, watching it back, I can't believe it went that smooth. We still have a lot to finish up, and when we do, we're going to have to celebrate with some ice cream. But until then, thanks for watching.